Sarah sat at the dinner table, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up her fork. The food looked delicious: perfectly cooked chicken, vegetables sautéed just right, and the unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread filling the room. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Peterson, watched her with a proud smile. "You're not eating enough, Sarah," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice warm and inviting. "Eat more, dear. It's good for you." Sarah forced a smile and nodded. "I'm fine, really." But deep down, she could feel the familiar tightness in her stomach. Every time she ate dinner at her in-laws' house, this feeling crept in. A heavy, uneasy sensation that would slowly build up until it became too much to bear. But Sarah didn't want to seem rude. This was her husband's family. She didn't want to make a fuss. As she took a bite of the chicken, she could feel the nausea starting to rise within her. Not again, she thought to herself. This had been happening for weeks now, almost every time she ate dinner at their house. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the conversation around her. Her husband, Jack, was sitting beside her, laughing at his father's joke. His family was so warm, so welcoming. But Sarah couldn't help but feel like something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just the sickness, it was the feeling that she was being watched. Her mother-in-law always seemed to keep an eye on her, as if checking whether she was eating enough or not. But whenever Sarah tried to talk to her husband about how she felt, Jack brushed it off. He told her it was just stress, or perhaps an upset stomach from the long workday. "Maybe you just need to relax a little," Jack said one night when she complained of feeling ill after dinner. "You're overthinking things." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the evening went on, Sarah forced herself to finish the meal. She didn't want to seem ungrateful, but just like every other time, after the dinner ended, her stomach churned. "I'm going to head to the bathroom for a second," Sarah said quietly, excusing herself. She rushed to the bathroom, clutching her stomach. It was worse this time. She leaned over the sink, breathing deeply to calm herself. Her body had begun to reject the food in a way she couldn't explain. Her face turned pale as cold sweat formed on her forehead. Why does this always happen here? She wondered if maybe it was the food. Maybe she was allergic to something, or maybe it was just a coincidence. But the more she thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. After a few minutes, she splashed cold water on her face and returned to the dining room. "You okay?" Jack asked, his voice laced with concern. "Yeah," Sarah lied, forcing a smile. "Just needed a minute." But as the night went on, she couldn't stop thinking about it. What was happening to her? Why did she always feel like this after dinner at her in-laws? The next few days were filled with discomfort. Every meal, no matter where she ate, was followed by a wave of sickness. But the worst came when she found herself dreading dinners at her in-laws' house. The thought of another meal that would leave her feeling weak, dizzy, and nauseous was almost too much to bear. One afternoon, while Sarah was at home alone, she decided to take a closer look at the ingredients in her mother-in-law's cooking. She had never been one to question food. After all, Mrs. Peterson was an excellent cook, but she couldn't ignore her body's reaction any longer. She found a container of chicken broth in the pantry and read the label. It seemed fine. Then she picked up the jar of spices that her mother-in-law always used in her cooking. Nothing unusual. Everything looked normal. So why did she feel so sick every time she ate? A thought crossed Sarah's mind. Could it be something in the food? But what? The next time dinner came around, she was determined to figure it out. That evening, as the Peterson family gathered around the table, Sarah felt the familiar wave of nausea rising in her stomach. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the conversation. Jack was talking about his new job, and his parents were listening intently, proud of him. But Sarah couldn't concentrate. She picked at her food, trying to eat just enough to not draw attention to herself. But it was too much. Her stomach churned painfully, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She excused herself again and rushed to the bathroom. As she stood there, gripping the sink, she felt defeated. What is wrong with me? She wondered. She felt like she was losing control of her own body. But this time, something changed. She decided that she wouldn't let it slide anymore. I need to find out what's going on, Sarah whispered to herself. Sarah knew she had to find out what was making her sick. But little did she know, her investigation would lead her to uncover something far darker than she ever imagined. Sarah sat at the edge of the bathroom sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sickness she'd been experiencing every time she ate at her in-laws' house wasn't just a coincidence. But what could it be? Why had it only started happening recently? She thought back to the many meals she'd shared at their house. At first, everything had been normal. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Peterson, was kind and welcoming, always making sure the food was just right. Jack's family was everything she had hoped for, warm, loving, and eager to include her in their lives. But now, each meal felt like a trial. Sarah's mind raced. What was it about the food? She knew she needed to get to the bottom of it. She had to understand why she kept getting so sick after eating. But where would she start? The thought of confronting her mother-in-law directly made Sarah nervous. Mrs. Peterson was not the type to take criticism well, and Sarah didn't want to cause tension within the family. But she also knew she couldn't keep ignoring the problem. Her health was at risk, and something had to change. I'll figure this out, Sarah whispered to herself, determination filling her chest. The next few days felt like a blur. Every meal at her in-laws' house left Sarah feeling worse than the last. The nausea, dizziness, and cold sweats became unbearable. She started to dread dinner time, even though she loved spending time with Jack's family. But something in the back of her mind told her that there was more to the story than she realized. One afternoon, while Jack was at work, Sarah made a decision. She would take matters into her own hands. She grabbed her phone and made a list of everything she needed. A few basic ingredients from her in-laws' kitchen, a couple of empty containers, and a plan. She was going to make sure that whatever was happening to her wasn't just a coincidence. That evening, after the family had finished dinner and everyone was relaxing in the living room, Sarah slipped into the kitchen. Mrs. Peterson had left to help her husband with something, so the kitchen was empty. Sarah quietly walked over to the stove, where a pot of stew had been left to simmer. She lifted the lid carefully, inhaling the familiar smell of herbs and spices. Everything looked normal, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She had to be sure. Without anyone noticing, she took a spoon and dipped it into the pot. She placed the spoonful of stew into a small container, then wrapped it in foil. Next, she quietly opened the spice cabinet and scanned the jars. She grabbed a small bottle labeled seasoning blend and added a small sample of it to her container. It seemed harmless enough, but something about it made her suspicious. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sarah slipped the container into her bag and left the kitchen just as quietly as she had entered. When she got home that evening, she wasted no time. She took the sample to a local lab, hoping they could find something, anything, that might explain what was causing her constant illness. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, Sarah received a call from the lab. The results were ready. "Hello, Mrs. Peterson," the voice on the other end asked. "It's Sarah," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've completed the analysis of the sample you submitted. I'm afraid the seasoning blend you provided contains something very unusual. It appears to have a high level of a chemical compound not typically found in cooking spices. It's potentially harmful if consumed over time." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean by harmful?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "While it might not cause immediate harm to everyone, it can cause nausea, dizziness, and upset stomach when ingested in larger amounts. Some people are more sensitive to it than others. You might want to avoid consuming any food made with that particular seasoning." Sarah felt a wave of relief, but also dread. She had found the source of her sickness. But the bigger question remained: why had her mother-in-law been using this harmful seasoning? Was it intentional? Was someone trying to harm her? As Sarah hung up the phone, her thoughts raced. She couldn't believe what she had just learned. Had Mrs. Peterson knowingly been using the spice in her cooking? Or was it an accident? The more Sarah thought about it, the more confused she became. That evening, when Jack came home from work, Sarah was still processing the information. She hadn't told him yet. She wasn't sure how to. "Sarah, you okay?" Jack asked, his concern clear. I don't know," she replied. "Jack, there's something I need to tell you. It's about your mom's cooking." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I've been getting sick after every dinner at your parents' house. I thought it was just stress or something, but I had the food analyzed. The seasoning your mom uses is harmful. It contains a chemical that's making me sick." Jack's expression changed from confusion to concern. "What? That's impossible. My mom has been cooking for years, and nothing like that has ever happened." "I know it sounds crazy, but I have proof," Sarah said, showing him the lab report. "I don't know why your mom would use it, but I need you to understand that I'm not imagining things." Jack stared at the report, his face going pale. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "I need to talk to my mom about this." Sarah's heart raced. She didn't know what to expect from the conversation that was about to unfold. Would Jack believe her? Would his mother admit to using the seasoning? Or was there something deeper going on? Something Sarah wasn't ready to uncover yet. One thing was certain. She was about to find out the truth, whether she was ready for it or not. The following evening, Sarah found herself standing in the living room, her hands trembling. Jack had asked his mother, Mrs. Peterson, to come over for a talk. Sarah wasn't sure how she felt about the conversation that was about to unfold. She had never imagined something like this happening in her marriage. But now, there was no turning back. She had to know the truth. Jack was pacing nervously, and Sarah could feel his anxiety. He had tried to reach out to his mother earlier, but she'd been avoiding the subject, making excuses about being busy with other things. But tonight, they were going to get to the bottom of it. When the doorbell rang, Jack straightened up, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She was about to face her worst fear, the confrontation with Mrs. Peterson. She didn't want to seem like the bad guy, but her health was at risk. She had to know what was really going on. Jack opened the door, and there stood his mother, looking as put together as ever. Mrs. Peterson had a warm smile on her face, but there was a slight edge to it, as if she knew this meeting wasn't going to be a casual one. "Come in, Mom," Jack said, stepping aside. Mrs. Peterson entered, glancing at Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Sarah forced a smile, but inside, she was a bundle of nerves. "Mom, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice more serious than usual. "It's about the seasoning you've been using in your cooking." The smile faded from Mrs. Peterson's face. "What about it?" she asked, her tone a little sharper than usual. Sarah took a deep breath. I had the food analyzed. The seasoning you use has a harmful chemical in it. It's been making me sick every time I eat at your house." There was a long pause. Mrs. Peterson blinked, clearly shocked. "What do you mean, harmful chemical? That's impossible. I've been using that seasoning for years, and nothing like that has ever happened before." Sarah stood up straighter. "I'm not making this up. I had it tested at the lab, and the results came back with proof that it's dangerous. I don't know why you've been using it, but it's making me sick. Every time I eat your food, I feel awful." Mrs. Peterson crossed her arms, clearly defensive. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "I've always cooked for you, and you've never had any problem before. You're just being dramatic." Sarah felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She had hoped that Mrs. Peterson would at least acknowledge the possibility that something had gone wrong, but instead, she was being dismissed. Jack was silent, watching the exchange between his wife and mother, trying to make sense of it all. "I'm not being dramatic," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "You have to understand, something is wrong. I've been trying to figure it out, and it's your food. I'm not blaming you, but I need you to believe me." Mrs. Peterson's eyes narrowed. "So what now? You think I've been trying to poison you? That's what this is about." The accusation hit Sarah like a slap in the face. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I don't think you've been doing it on purpose. I just don't understand why you've been using that seasoning. Maybe it's an accident, or maybe you didn't know, but it's affecting me." Jack finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Mom, if there's something wrong with the food, we need to figure out why. Sarah's health is on the line. I don't care if it's an accident or not. We need to fix it." Mrs. Peterson hesitated, her face softening slightly. "I never meant for this to happen," she said quietly, "but I don't know what to tell you. I've been using that seasoning for years, and I trust the brand. I didn't think anything could be wrong with it." Jack crossed the room and placed a hand on his mother's shoulder. "Then we need to find out exactly what's going on. I'm not blaming you, Mom, but we need to get to the bottom of it. We're a family, and we need to support each other." For a moment, Mrs. Peterson just stood there, silent, her eyes filled with confusion. Then she sighed deeply and looked at Sarah. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer now. "I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah. I just didn't know." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She had expected this to be much worse. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I just want to get better. I want to understand what happened." Jack looked between the two women, his heart heavy. He couldn't believe that something like this had come between them, but he was relieved to see that they were starting to talk honestly. "Well, we'll figure it out," Jack said, his tone resolute. "We'll find a solution." Sarah nodded. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt a small sense of relief. At least they were on the same page now. They had to move forward, no matter what. Mrs. Peterson turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Maybe I can get the seasoning tested myself," she suggested. "I'll call the company and see if there's been any issue with the product." "That would be great," Sarah said, feeling hopeful for the first time in days. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson." As the conversation died down, the tension in the room slowly began to ease. The truth had been revealed, and though it wasn't the answer Sarah had hoped for, it was a step in the right direction. But in the back of her mind, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was still so much more to uncover about the seasoning, about Mrs. Peterson's role in it, and about the family dynamics that had been hidden beneath the surface. The story was far from over. Days passed, and the weight of the conversation with Mrs. Peterson hung in the air. Sarah tried to focus on her daily routine, but the unease that had settled in her heart wouldn't go away. She wanted to believe that her mother-in-law's actions were a simple mistake. Yet the more she thought about it, the more Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't adding up. Jack did his best to reassure her. "We'll figure it out, Sarah," he'd say. "Mom is just trying to make it right. She's already reached out to the company, and they're looking into it." But Sarah's concern only deepened. The thought of how many times she had been made ill by that seasoning haunted her. Was it really just an accident? Or was there something more sinister at play? The phone call that Sarah had been waiting for came late one afternoon. Mrs. Peterson called, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she picked up the receiver. "Sarah." Mrs. Peterson's voice sounded more serious than usual. "I got the results back from the company." Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. There was a long pause on the other end before Mrs. Peterson finally spoke. "The seasoning, it was contaminated. The chemical I was using, it was never supposed to be in there. The company made a mistake in their production process, and it slipped through the cracks. It's what caused the sickness. It's not your fault, Sarah. You were right. I'm so sorry." Sarah felt a wave of relief and disbelief wash over her. She'd known something wasn't right, but hearing it confirmed still left her feeling shaken. It's contaminated," Sarah whispered, the words feeling unreal. "But how? How could they let that happen? Mrs. Peterson sighed heavily. I don't know, but they've already recalled the product. They're taking steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. But I didn't know, Sarah. I really didn't know. I trusted them. Sarah's mind raced. So, all this time, I was getting sick because of that seasoning. Yes, Mrs. Peterson replied quietly. And I feel awful for not realizing sooner. Sarah closed her eyes and leaned against the wall. The world seemed to spin for a moment as she processed what she had just learned. A part of her wanted to cry in relief that it wasn't anything personal, that her mother-in-law hadn't meant to hurt her. But another part of her felt frustrated, angry that it had taken so long for the truth to come out. It's okay, Sarah finally said, taking a deep breath. At least we know now. I wish I had known sooner, Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice breaking. I never meant to make you feel sick. I was just trying to feed you like I always have. Sarah felt a knot in her throat. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but we need to be more careful from now on. Please, for the future, let me bring my own food if I'm coming over. I don't want to risk getting sick again. Mrs. Peterson was silent for a moment, and then she said, Of course, Sarah. I completely understand. I'll make sure nothing like this happens again. Sarah's heart softened. It wasn't an easy thing to admit, but it was clear that her mother-in-law truly hadn't known about the issue. There had been no malice or ill intent. It had simply been a mistake, one that had left her feeling unwell for weeks. I'm glad you understand, Sarah replied, her voice gentle now. And thank you for being honest with me. It means a lot. After a long pause, Mrs. Peterson spoke again, her voice sincere. I promise, Sarah, from now on, I'll be more careful. I care about you and want you to feel comfortable and safe. Sarah nodded, the tension in her chest slowly easing. Thank you. That's all I needed to hear. The conversation ended on a quieter note, but Sarah's mind was still racing. She couldn't help but reflect on the weeks of sickness, the feeling of being misunderstood, and the tension it had caused in her marriage. But now that she had the truth, things felt clearer. However, there was still one question lingering in the back of her mind. Why had it taken so long for the company to reveal the contamination? And why had it taken even longer for Mrs. Peterson to come forward with the truth? The days that followed were filled with small steps toward healing. Mrs. Peterson came over more frequently, bringing homemade dishes that didn't contain the dangerous seasoning. She was careful, asking Sarah what she wanted to eat, respecting her wishes, and trying to make amends for the harm done. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There were still unanswered questions about the contamination and whether other people had been affected. The seasonings had been sold to several stores, and Mrs. Peterson was now considering a lawsuit against the company for their negligence. But Sarah was torn. She didn't want to stir things up further, but at the same time, she felt a sense of responsibility for others who might have been hurt. One evening, while sitting with Jack, she shared her concerns. Do you think we should do something about this, Jack? What if there are more people out there who've been affected and haven't realized it? Jack paused, thinking carefully. Maybe we should look into it, he said slowly. We need to make sure that people don't go through what you did. It's not just about us. It's about doing the right thing for others too. Sarah felt a sense of resolve settle over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure the truth was known, about helping others avoid the same mistakes she had made. And so, the journey wasn't over, not for Sarah, not for Jack, and not for Mrs. Peterson. It was a new chapter in their lives, one of honesty, healing, and understanding. But the question remained, would they be able to hold the company accountable? Would the truth come out completely? And would Sarah ever fully trust the food she ate again? The answers would come in time. For now, though, they had each other, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and Sarah felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, she had come to terms with the fact that her mother-in-law hadn't intentionally caused her harm, and she could now enjoy family dinners without the dread of getting sick. but there was still an undeniable weight pressing down on her, a sense of unfinished business that couldn't be shaken off. The company's negligence in allowing the contaminated seasoning to hit the shelves haunted Sarah. She knew that many people, just like her, might have suffered the same fate without ever realizing the cause of their illnesses. She couldn't ignore the fact that she was one of the lucky ones. She'd discovered the truth before things got worse. Others might not be as fortunate. It was late one evening when she brought up the idea to Jack. They were sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the TV flickering in the background, but it was the conversation between them that kept her focused. "Jack," Sarah began, her voice quiet but determined, "I've been thinking about the company. I feel like we need to do something about it, not just for us, but for anyone else who might be affected." Jack turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if there are more people who are suffering like I did, and they don't even know why? What if they haven't figured it out yet?" Sarah's voice wavered as she spoke, the frustration that had been building inside her for weeks coming to the surface. What if it's happened to other families? Jack took a deep breath. He understood the urgency in her words, the concern for people she didn't even know. But at the same time, he was cautious. They had already dealt with a lot. "I get it, Sarah. I really do. But going after the company, it could open up a lot of problems. Legal battles, stress, all of that. Do you really think it's worth it?" Sarah sat back, feeling the surge of determination flood her chest. She had spent too many nights lying awake, thinking about the unknown victims of this situation. She couldn't just sit back and let it go. "I don't want to sit back and let this happen to others, Jack," Sarah replied firmly. "It's not just about us anymore. It's about making sure that people know what's going on, about making sure the company takes responsibility. If we don't speak up, who will?" Jack looked at her for a long time, seeing the fire in her eyes, the passion that burned for justice. He could tell how much this meant to her. Finally, he nodded, his voice calm yet resolute. "Okay, you're right. Let's do it. But we have to be careful, Sarah. We can't rush into this blindly." The decision was made. The next morning, Sarah reached out to a lawyer. She knew that this would be a long and complicated road, but the possibility of holding the company accountable for their negligence filled her with a sense of purpose. The lawyer was sympathetic to her case and agreed that they had a strong reason to pursue legal action. He made it clear, however, that it would be a tough fight. The company would have a team of powerful lawyers, and they would likely try to settle quickly to avoid public scrutiny. But Sarah wasn't looking for a quick payout. She wanted answers. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been affected by the contamination. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peterson continued to express her regret. She had offered her support to Sarah, encouraging her to go ahead with the lawsuit if that's what she felt was right. But Sarah could see the fear in her mother-in-law's eyes. She didn't want to see her family torn apart over this. Still, Sarah knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, it was something that had to be done. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself consumed by the lawsuit process. She spent hours with the lawyer, going over evidence, filling out forms, and gathering all the details about the contaminated seasoning. It was draining work, but Sarah was driven by the idea of bringing the truth to light. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she had experienced, to suffer without knowing the cause of their pain. Then one day they got the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The lawyer received a letter from the company's legal team. It was an invitation to discuss a settlement. At first, Sarah felt a wave of relief. Maybe this was the sign that the company would take responsibility and settle fairly. But as she read through the details of the letter, her heart sank. The settlement offer was far less than she had expected. The company was offering money, of course, but it came with a condition. They wanted Sarah to sign a non-disclosure agreement, essentially silencing her from speaking out about the contamination. Sarah was stunned. She felt betrayed. This wasn't about money for her. This was about the truth. She knew she couldn't accept the offer. Jack was by her side when she made the decision. "I won't sign that," Sarah said firmly, her voice full of resolve. "We're not doing this for the money. We're doing it so that people know the truth." Jack supported her decision, but he also warned her that things would get harder from here. The company wouldn't back down easily, and they would fight tooth and nail to keep the situation quiet. Sarah knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges. The company was powerful, and they had the resources to drag this out for as long as they wanted. But Sarah was more determined than ever. She had started this journey for justice, and she wasn't going to stop now. Not for anyone, not for anything. The fight for accountability had only just begun. Months had passed since Sarah made the decision to stand up for what she believed was right. The lawsuit against the company had become an exhausting battle. The stress, the long days of paperwork, and the constant worry over the outcome weighed heavily on her. But through it all, she never wavered. She couldn't. Not when she knew how much was at stake, not just for her, but for anyone who might be suffering from the same issue she had. The company had pulled every trick in the book to try to settle the case quickly, offering Sarah a few payments along the way, hoping that she would take the money and walk away. But Sarah refused every time. She wasn't in this for a paycheck. She was in this for justice. And she wasn't about to let the company sweep everything under the rug just because they had the resources to do so. The trial date had finally been set, and with it came the culmination of everything Sarah had worked for. It was nerve-wracking. The courtroom was filled with the company's legal team, their best attorneys dressed in sharp suits, confident in their ability to win. On the other side, Sarah sat with her lawyer, Jack by her side, looking as determined as ever. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the judge called the session to order. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. It had taken everything she had to get to this point. All the sleepless nights, the constant pressure, the doubts, everything had led to this moment. The company's lawyer stood up first, launching into a speech filled with legal jargon, attempting to downplay the seriousness of the situation. They argued that Sarah's illness was not directly linked to their product, trying to sow doubt in the minds of the jurors. But Sarah's lawyer was ready. He stood up and countered with facts, laying out the evidence they had gathered over the months. They presented the contaminated seasoning, detailed reports from experts who had tested the product, and testimonies from people who had experienced similar symptoms. Each piece of evidence was a small victory, and with each one, Sarah felt a flicker of hope ignite inside her. The room was quiet as Sarah took the stand. She wasn't the type to be the center of attention. But this was different. This was for the truth. This was for every person who had been silenced by corporate greed and negligence. As she spoke about her experience, the nausea, the pain, the fear, Sarah felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was telling the story of everyone who had been affected, everyone who didn't have the voice or the resources to fight back. Sarah's voice shook slightly as she described the turning point when she had figured out what had been making her sick. She recalled the day she brought her own dish to the dinner, the look on her mother-in-law's face when Sarah discovered the seasoning's contamination. The memory of that moment, of uncovering the truth, still made Sarah feel sick. But she didn't let it stop her. She had to continue. "The truth matters," Sarah said, her eyes locking with the jury. "It's not just about what happened to me. It's about the people who have no idea that they're being harmed. It's about making sure that no one else has to suffer like I did." The company's lawyer tried to undermine her, asking irrelevant questions and attempting to make her seem dramatic. But Sarah stood firm, her confidence growing with each passing moment. After hours of testimony, it was time for closing arguments. The room was silent, the tension palpable. The company's lawyer stood up, making a final attempt to discredit Sarah and her lawyer. They suggested that it was all just a coincidence, that Sarah had no solid proof linking the illness to the seasoning. They argued that the company had done nothing wrong. But then Sarah's lawyer rose. He looked at the jury, his voice calm and clear. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said. "We have shown you the facts. We have shown you the truth. This company allowed a contaminated product to reach consumers, and because of their negligence, people were harmed. They should be held accountable. Sarah sat in her seat, her heart in her throat. She knew this wasn't just a battle for her. It was for everyone who had suffered quietly, without anyone knowing the real cause. It was for the people who had no voice, who had been left in the dark. The jury deliberated for hours. Each minute felt like an eternity. Jack sat next to her, holding her hand, offering silent support. They had come this far, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder if all of this effort would be in vain. Finally, after what felt like an age, the jury returned to the courtroom. The judge called the room to order, and the silence was deafening. The foreman of the jury stood up, holding the verdict in his hand. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room. We, the jury, find the defendant, the company, guilty of negligence. The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, Sarah didn't know whether to breathe or cry. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Sarah was frozen in place. It was happening. Justice was being served. The company was ordered to pay damages, not just for Sarah's medical expenses, but for the emotional toll it had taken on her and for the suffering of others who had been affected by the contaminated seasoning. But more importantly, the company was ordered to recall the product and publicly acknowledge their negligence. As the judge called the session to a close, Sarah felt a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She had fought the fight, and she had won. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone who had been affected. She turned to Jack, her eyes filled with tears. "We did it," she whispered, as the weight of the last few months finally lifted off her shoulders. Jack smiled, squeezing her hand. "You did it, Sarah. You never gave up." Sarah smiled back, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't just the victory that mattered. It was the truth that had finally been revealed. The battle had been long, but it had been worth every second. The courtroom was a quiet sea of anticipation, each person holding their breath, waiting for the moment they had all been waiting for. It had taken months of grueling preparation, sleepless nights, and endless paperwork, but it all came down to this. Sarah sat at the edge of her seat, her hands trembling in her lap, as the judge slowly raised the paper with the jury's verdict. The silence was so thick, it felt as though time had stopped. Jack, her lawyer, sat beside her, his calm demeanor offering her some comfort. But even he couldn't hide the nervous tension in his eyes. He had fought tirelessly alongside her, but this moment was bigger than any of them. The weight of the entire case rested on the jury's decision. The judge cleared his throat, the room seemingly holding its collective breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, the company, guilty of negligence," the judge read aloud, his voice steady but firm. For a split second, the words didn't register. Then it hit Sarah, like a wave crashing over her. She blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. She looked over at Jack, and the realization began to sink in. They had won. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt an overwhelming sense of relief flood through her. The months of uncertainty, the constant battle, the self-doubt, everything melted away in that moment. She had stood up for the truth, and now it had paid off. The room erupted in murmurs, some of excitement, others in shock. The company's lawyers sat stone-faced, their expressions unreadable, but Sarah didn't care. They had tried to cover up the truth, tried to make her doubt herself, but now the truth was out. The judge continued, "The defendant is ordered to recall the contaminated product from the market immediately and to compensate the plaintiff for medical expenses and emotional damages. The company is also required to issue a public statement acknowledging their negligence." Sarah could hardly believe it. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had been affected by the tainted seasoning. For everyone who had been quietly suffering, unaware of the cause. It was for the people who didn't have the resources or the platform to stand up and fight back. As the judge called the session to a close, Sarah felt her body go numb with relief. It was over. The long, exhausting battle had come to an end, and justice had been served. Jack turned to her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "You never gave up." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She wanted to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. It had been a long road, filled with doubt and frustration, but she had made it. She had fought for what was right, and now she had won. Sarah stood up, her legs weak, as she took a moment to breathe it all in. The relief, the joy, the sense of accomplishment. It was overwhelming. But there was also something else, something deeper. She had fought not just for herself, but for others who had been harmed, for those who had suffered in silence. As she made her way out of the courtroom, she saw the faces of the people who had supported her. Jack, her friends, even strangers who had followed her story. They were all there, smiling, congratulating her. But it was in that moment that Sarah realized what this victory truly meant. It was never just about the lawsuit. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, of not letting injustice go unchallenged. Outside, the sun was shining, its warmth a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had just raged inside the courtroom. Sarah paused, taking in the fresh air, feeling like she had finally come up for a breath after being submerged for so long. She looked at Jack, her heart full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly. Jack nodded. "We did this together. You were the one who kept going when it seemed impossible. You showed everyone that the truth always finds a way." Sarah smiled, her eyes misty with emotion. She had won. Not just the case, but her own sense of strength and purpose. The world would never be the same again, and neither would she. As she stepped out of the courthouse, she realized that the journey was far from over. This victory was just the beginning. Now that the truth had been exposed, there was so much more work to be done. The company would have to face the consequences of their actions, and Sarah would continue to be a voice for those who had been wronged. But for now, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had fought, and she had won. The world was finally listening, and in that moment, Sarah knew that she had made a difference.